Hello everyone and welcome to the New Normal Speaker Series. My name is Gjoko and I am the director of the Ullman School of Design. My special guest today is Alok Vaid-Menon. Alok is a gender non-conforming writer, poet, fashion designer, and performance artist, widely recognized for their distinctive style. As a mixed media artist, Alok explores themes of gender, race, trauma, belonging, and the human condition. Alok, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
One of the topics that I would like for us to discuss today is gender neutrality. I believe that this is a topic that needs to be discussed more often and more openly. I think that the lack of doing so is not only causing ignorance, but a lack of empathy and compassion. So let's start with some basics. How would you describe gender neutrality?
Sure. So I think that one of the things that is really important for people to understand is that clothing is already gender neutral. So it's not just that gender neutrality appears when there's a non-binary designer, or that it appears when a collection is marketed as gender neutral, because clothing is actually inanimate objects. So clothing doesn't actually have a gender. When we say women's clothing and men's clothing, that's always confused me, because clothing can't think and declare itself a gender. So we're actually recruiting inanimate objects into our socially constructed ideas of gender, and it's not that they inherently have a gender. So gender neutrality is actually not something that is coming in and erasing gender. It's what already exists before gender is imposed on it. So gender neutrality is the default. It's the organic. It's the origin. It's often discussed as a force that's coming in to erase or take away. Actually, the force that came in was the gendering itself, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have been a very prominent advocate for gender neutral fashion. So let's talk a little bit more about it. I actually think that's a very interesting topic, as you just pointed out. So why do we need gender neutral fashion to become the new normal? Let's talk a little bit more about that.
So it's so great that we're having this interview today, because Vogue just released their December issue, which is the first time ever having a cis male as the cover, Harry Styles. And in all of the portraits, he's actually wearing gowns from Gucci, gowns from Harry Lambert, a stylist that he works with. And when I was sort of reading the article this morning, I was like, wow, this is such a huge moment in contemporary culture. Never did I think in my lifetime that we'd be able to have someone who identifies as a man wearing a gown in American Vogue. But I think it's really important to understand how we got to this moment. So one of the things that people often don't know is that in the Western world, in New York City in particular, where I live, it used to be illegal to, quote, cross-dress from about 1870s until 1970s, so an entire century, because there were a series of laws called the masquerade laws. And the masquerade laws essentially required people to wear at least 3 articles of clothing consistent with their assigned sex, otherwise be thrown into prison. So in the early 1900s, women would be arrested for wearing suits and men would be arrested for wearing dresses. And it was only because of the tireless activism of trans communities who were continually being arrested and thrown into prison that those kinds of laws were repealed in the 1970s after the Stonewall riot. So one of the reasons that it's really important to degender fashion or have gender neutral fashion for me is first and foremost as an anti-violence mechanism, because we exist in a world where if people see someone like me, who they perceive as a man, wearing articles of clothing that they perceive to be women's clothing, they see that as incongruity and therefore they respond with violence. Whereas if we say that anyone can wear a skirt, anyone can wear makeup, there isn't that same sense of dissonance. So therefore the violence is decreased. So a lot of my advocacy in this space is actually because I'm trying to end gender-based violence. And that doesn't just look like physical violence, that also looks like when, say, cis men want to wear pink and people will be like, that's not masculine, you shouldn't do that. Or when women don't want to have to wear makeup and people are like, that's not appropriate, you shouldn't have to do that. These ideas of gendering beauty and gendering clothing actually end up harming everyone. Then I think the second reason it's really important is because fashion, for me, should be about creative expression, not about categorization. That fashion is an art form, and part of the purpose of art is to blur these kind of arbitrary norms and is to question and provoke culture. And so I actually say that gendering fashion is holding fashion design back because people are more invested in reproducing stereotypes than reproducing beauty. And when I think about my favorite designers, people like Alexander McQueen, what they were doing was actually trying to evolve fashion and to reimagine what a silhouette was, or reimagine what a shoe was. How can we say, wow, we're so creative, but we're still dividing people into one of two categories? That's an inconsistency with me. Creativity reveals all categories to be artificial and unambitious. And then I think that the third point is that this is not even historically new. So one of the things that I really do in my work is I trace the history of gender and fashion. And what I've sort of determined is that a lot of what we now call feminine, so things like wigs, makeup, heels, leggings, plumed lace, was actually worn by men for hundreds of years in Europe. And that actually, when we're saying gender neutrality, we're just hearkening back to what already was. It's not a new thing. It's actually about returning to an old thing. And the reason that lace and heels became associated with femininity is after the Enlightenment and the sort of Industrial Revolution, you see this introduction of separate spheres for men and women. So men are supposed to be productive workers, women are supposed to stay at home and take care of domesticity. And part of the way that fashion design shifted in that moment was that women were tasked with wearing clothing that could not be worked in, like corsets or gowns. They were seen as just accessories and ornamentalized objects, whereas men were allowed to wear more functional clothing. And as I really take a lot of inspiration from an art historian named Anne Hollander, what Anne Hollander writes is that the suit for men actually became a way of emphasizing that men had legs and that they could walk and work, whereas the gown and the skirt was created to create the sense of mystery and allure around womanhood, that they could just belong to where men imagined that they should be. So actually, my third point is this is also resisting sexism and misogyny, that we still have these ideas that feminine garb is weak, masculine garb is strong, and that men are the sort of like agile, rational thinkers, and women are the ridiculous, hyper excessive, hyper stylized, hyper characterized tropes, when actually all of us have both of those attributes in us. We should be able to say, okay, I'm dressing for function and I'm dressing for beauty in the same day with different events, you know? And so I think that so much of the consternation right now about degendering fashion is misplaced because they will accuse us of advancing a sort of novel, new thing, but it's actually very quite old.
It's you're absolutely correct in terms of the way how you pointed out, historically speaking, that fashion, especially in the French court and for the French upper class, was completely different to what we perceive today. And it was really, there was no that type of blend between femininity and masculinity, neither in behavior, neither in clothing. So that is very interesting to see how the social norms and the social construct of fashion changes in terms of genders over time. So that is actually, it's a very interesting point. Why do you think people fear degendering fashion today?
Yeah, you know, I spent a lot of time thinking about this because it really makes no sense from a functional perspective. Like, if it's 100 degrees outside in the summer, every man would benefit from wearing a skirt instead of a suit. It's just more functional. Um,
In some cultures, they
especially,
do wear saris and so
right,
on.
exactly. You know, and where I'm from in India, in South India, in particular, we have a silhouette called the lungi or the dhoti, which is a sort of wraparound. And that's what we do there because it's so hot outside. So it actually would improve everyone's life to be able to have a wider variety of things that they could wear depending on circumstances. And so it's not a rational resistance. It's a emotional, psychological, traumatic resistance. I think what it really is the irony is that people like me who are visibly different are accused of wearing a costume. But truthfully, the costume in society is the uniform that society gives to people so that they don't stand out. And I think that we've been disciplined, especially in the Western world, into this idea that you should be part of a mass that's conforming, and standing out actually means that you're putting yourself in harm's way or that you think that you're better than other people. All these connotations are added to individuality. And it's ironic to me that in the United States, there's this rhetoric of freedom when in fact there's compulsory conformity. That freedom is just that, a rhetoric, not a daily practice. And so I think people are afraid of looking different and they would rather opt to look same and interchangeable and homogenous. I experience this a lot in the winter because in the winter, everyone starts wearing gray and black. And I'm so confused. So I find like fuchsia coats, neon like heels, and I'm still warm. And people like stare at me and there's a fear of color. And so I've been trying to understand why there's a fear of color within Western aesthetic sensibilities. There's a really amazing book called Chromophobia, which is about the fear of color. And it actually traces how so much of the colonial encounter was about dismissing non-Western nations and indigenous peoples as brightly colored, as not matching, as vibrantly patterned, as ornamentalized is the word that they would use. And so much of the way that Western modernity and Western aesthetics worked was actually about resisting adornment. There's actually a Viennese architect named Alfred Loos who has a book called Ornament and Crime. And in the book, he basically makes the argument that Europe and Western civilization has evolved from ornamentality and accessory, and now is moving to streamlined aesthetics. So what we actually see is a multi-century long project of streamlining fashion into the uniform. And I think we can only understand that in like a post-Fordist capitalist mentality of mass production. Part of the way that mass fashion production works, we're talking about brands like Gap or H&M, is that they are trying to basically create a trope that can be reproduced over and over and over and over again. And that's why I think that there's a distinction for me between style and fashion. Fashion is what is marketed to us and already has sort of templates of this is what it means to be a professional man. This is what it means to be a secretary. Whereas style is about the reclamation of fashion for your own individual sartorial and aesthetic choices. So what I actually am committed to is an anti-fashion. And what anti-fashion for me is actually about saying things, when we say such and such is in fashion, I don't believe that because that's what advertising, that's what media is trying to push. What's in fashion is what you feel like is in fashion. And so I think the larger spiritual crisis is people don't know how to express themselves. We live in a template culture that requires people to fit into certain categories and boxes, and they only know who they are in relation to those predetermined categories and boxes. And when you actually ask people, what do you feel? They don't know how to describe that because they've been dispossessed of that kind of creative vocabulary. And so I think fashion for me is part of a larger kind of crisis of creativity within the Western sort of world, where people now think it's only the artists, the professionalized artists who do the work of creativity. But I push back and say all of us can be creative, and style is a really powerful way to bring art everywhere that we go. Because in the Western world, art is often sequestered into the gallery, into the museum, onto the billboard. But the reason I love style and clothing is it brings those aesthetic questions everywhere that you go, when you're lecturing in class, when you're walking outside in the street. And therefore, people are reminded constantly, wow, there's beauty in this world, there's creativity in this world, there's experimentation in this world. And I think that those values, that things are in flux, challenges an entire epistemology that requires the myth that things are static. I think that so much of the way that Western control of the population works is by saying things are unchangeable. This is how it's always been. But I think what we can know as fashion theorists and historians is like, actually, fashion is in constant flux. What's in 1 minute changes the next minute. And that motion is just what it means to be alive. Like movement is actually just the natural order of the universe. So any attempt to stay in one form is kind of ridiculous to me.
Yeah, fashion is a very temporary construct. Style, on the other hand, it's something much deeper that has a bigger longevity about it. And it represents very different thing than fashion, I think personally, because style is it's a form of expression that goes beyond pursuing trends. You know, so it tells more about the person that has a style than a person that pursues fashion. I think it shows more about the character of the person. Right. You know, it's very interesting thing. When I used to travel around the Pacific, I learned that in the Polynesian culture, specifically in Samoa, there is a very widely accepted notion of third gender. Mm-hmm. Have you come across that?
Yes, totally.
Yeah, I find it very, very fascinating because, like, you may assume that in metropolitan areas such as New York and so on, that will be far more accepted. But no. And then in a remote island, in the tribes, Polynesian tribes, in remote islands in the Pacific, you will find that the society actually embraces that idea.
Yeah.
And that they recognize the third gender as a part of the community, part of the social fabric. So I found it very fascinating. They even have a specific word for that. Yes. Yeah. I could not quite pronounce it correctly, but thank you for, yeah.
Yeah, and even in places like Fiji, the male dress is actually a skirt.
Yes.
And so I think one of the points that I really try to make when I'm speaking about degendering fashion is that if you look at indigenous non-Western communities, they've been doing this since the very beginning. So it's like I grew up with men wearing skirts, but they weren't called skirts. They were called lungis or dhotis, and that was not a big issue. So much of what we imagine to be a silhouette that's masculine or feminine, it's actually Western. And then if you even look in the history of pre-modern Europe, like we were sort of alluding to before, there were also men wearing skirts and tunics and dresses. So that's why I think the only way to really diagnose this contemporary moment is to understand nationalism and is to understand how governmental regimes have a vested interest in creating a population that is conforming. And that's why I think its style has always been political for me. And it always baffles me that people dismiss fashion as superficial, when actually I think fashion is a profound space of political resistance, of deep, huge questions of being, difference, because what I wear can fundamentally shift not just the way that people treat me, but the very space that I'm in. So for example, if I walk around a street in New York City in a mini skirt, my presence fundamentally shifts that space. And we don't have that language yet to describe fashion as a force of politics. But I think what I'm really trying to do, especially as an activist and as an artist, is to get people to realize how we dress is political. And so often people will say, I don't care about fashion, I just wear, that's already a politics. There's no neutrality, there's no Switzerland when it comes to style. Absolutely. We're all engaging in a mode of communication. And I think we forget that the majority of communication is nonverbal. It's not often about what we're saying. It's rather more about what we look like. And that framework artists have been putting out forever can help understand this political moment in the United States. You know, so many people are so confused about the rise of right-wing nationalisms across the world, including in the US. And I'm like, if you speak to artists, we can actually let you know it's not about people thinking, it's about people feeling. And it's actually about the aesthetics of comfort. Doesn't matter what's actually happening. What matters is what people feel. And what people feel, in fact, is more real than what is manifesting. Because what we feel, and this is what phenomenology teaches us, being is being perceived, as Merleau-Ponty says. And so what we're trying to do in fashion is to shift the modes of perception. So I think that kind of piece around gender is really important because people have been taught a predetermined set of coordinates around what man is and what woman is. And what we're doing when we're politicizing fashion around challenging gender norms is we're trying to shift people's very perception of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. And in doing so, they have to question their own gender. So when someone sees me, they have to question themselves to be like, am I as secure as I thought that I was in my manhood or my womanhood? And then they realize, oh, I'm not. And so they resort to violence. But if they actually were secure in themselves, it wouldn't be a problem. But I just think about, you know, a couple of years ago, Jaden Smith, Will and Jada Pinkett Smith's son, wore a skirt and a Louis Vuitton campaign. And it was just, the internet was ablaze with like, what is going on? These Gen Z, they're blurring, this is horrible, this is disgusting. And I'm literally sitting there like, we don't yet have the vocabulary to describe this cultural encounter. Why is an image penetrating deep into the psyche? Why is a piece of fabric? Because what is the difference between a skirt and shorts is one like piece of fabric in between legs. That's why I think fashion is so important, where even the production of one image can have millions of reactions. And that's why I think, you know, it's so important the work that you're doing there. We need more academics writing and thinking critically about style and fashion, because even within the academy, there's this kind of way in which fine art is seen as engaging with deeper questions. So it's like if you're studying sculpture, if you're studying painting, but actually what is fashion but everyday sculpture? What is fashion but everyday painting?
No, you're absolutely right. Fashion as a concept is a much deeper idea than people realize. And it's a statement. Every time you go out in public and what you wear projects a statement about yourself. You know, you choose by your accessories and so on, you choose what to say about yourself. Even people who say, I don't care about fashion, I'll just wear whatever. That is also a statement.
Right.
You know, so they're also making a very conscious statement to project something about themselves by what they are wearing. So you cannot be neutral.
Right.
In fashion. And this is what makes it very interesting. And this is what makes your activism very thought-provoking in many ways, and, you know, avant-garde as well. So again, also what we discussed, generally, both gender and sex are cultural constructs, essentially. However, the mainstream society often views gender and sex only in biological terms. So what are the negative effects of this for transgender and gender non-conforming people?
Yeah, you know, I just really always bring up one book that changed my entire life in thinking about gender. It's called The Invention of Women by Oyewumi. And she's a Nigerian feminist who basically traces how a Western discourse of gender was imposed on indigenous Yoruba people in what is now Nigeria as part of British colonization. And one of the things that she points out is that in the West, there's this idea that your physical body correlates with your social identity. But that's a culturally contingent phenomenon within the Western world. She calls it a biocultural logic, where your visual cues signify who you are as a person. And what she instead says within traditional Yoruba frameworks, it wasn't gender as the division of society, it was age. And that actually elders had the power. which means that there were elder women and matrilineal and matriarchal traditions that are often erased. And so I take that provocation to actually remind people that in the West, there's this fiction that the body and biology are fixed and that gender and culture and fashion are the things that are changing. But there's always this there's this canvas, which is the body. So the West actually imagines the body as outside of culture, outside of mutability. But that is ridiculous because our bodies are constantly changing. Our bones are regenerating, our skin is shedding, our hair is changing, we excrete mucus, urine, we constantly are in flux. So what happens within the Western episteme is that they use this term nature and they hold it hostage to mean stuck or stagnant. But what I say is go outside and look at the sun, it's moving. Go outside and look at the water, it's moving. Go outside and look at the wind, nature is in flux. So what happens is because in the West, there's this preconceived idea that the body is fixed. What happens is when trans and gender nonconforming people reveal that body to not be as fixed as people perceive it to be, we experience violence because then rather than shift that paradigm and say, hey, maybe biology and nature can shift, they want to hold on to that arcane idea. So it's easier to eliminate us than it is to challenge the paradigm. So what the violence against trans and gender nonconforming people, and I can't underestimate this violence. In 2020, there have been 350 reported murders of trans and gender nonconforming people all across the world. That means that on average, every 32 hours, a trans person is murdered in the world. And that's a conservative estimate because oftentimes when we're attacked and killed, we're misgendered by the media, so we don't actually have accurate data. But what I can say is that in 2020, right now, we're in the most deadly year ever in recorded history in the US of over 35 murders of trans and gender nonconforming people. So the lethality with which people protect the myth of biology, that in many ways are soldiers, foot soldiers, for what is called biological determinism, this idea that you are just your rote body. And so I read the violence against trans and gender nonconforming people as nothing to do with us. We get recruited into a worldview that is so fragile and insecure that it can't coexist with anything that calls it into question. And so, as with any underdeveloped political fantasy, whenever you can't actually debate with something, you just try to destroy it. And so what we can learn from across time, I'm speaking here about, what happened with the Holocaust, what happened with various colonial projects across the world. You disappear the artists, you disappear the intellectuals, you disappear the dissidents, you disappear anyone who calls into question that kind of mainstream groupthink. And so I reimagine the violence against trans people, not because we're lacking, or not because we are different, or not because we're incongruent. That always puts the responsibility on us. The responsibility is put on us to disappear ourselves within the binary, to be less visible, to be more comfortable. But I actually don't think that we should have to change anything about what we look like. I think that they should have to change the way that they think. And I think that for me is the difference between liberation and reform. Reform would be, okay, I'm going to compromise what I look like to fit into this binary, to reproduce this thing. But I don't believe any of that is true. So the liberatory move is to not have to censor yourself to be palatable in order to fit into the sort of aesthetic regime. And I think that's where I take a lot of my inspiration from histories of avant-gardism. And I think that's why, for me, artists are already activists, because so much of the history of the avant-garde tradition, the history of experimental performance traditions, is only through provoking can we actually productively dislodge these kind of calcified ideas. It's not through civil discourse, it's not through policy, it's not through conversation. While those things are important, it's only through staging crisis can we actually get things that have become sedimented to, at least for a moment, be a little bit more loose. And so I take a lot of my fashion inspiration from the history, especially of the queer performance art tradition, of people who understood that drag was not just about a stage, but was actually about everywhere that you go. And people would say, why are you doing this? And people would sort of a lot of queer foremothers that I look up to would say, like Lee Bowery and all these people would say, like Sylvester, who was an amazing disco queen in the 1970s, they would just say, I'm just being myself. And I think that is one of the most revolutionary frameworks to counteract this kind of biological determinism, because biological determinism reduces you to a body without asking you, what do you feel about yourself? And so what we're actually trying to push as a trans movement is self-authorship and self-creation. And I think that relates to what we were saying before about the difference between fashion and style, is that how could we just have a pre-manufactured gender or sex that's like a factory line production, man, boy, girl, boy? That's ridiculous. Gender should be like every other thing that we create. It's something that only is unique to us. So my gender is different than your gender, is different than someone else's gender, in the same way that all of our styles are different from one another.
Mm-hmm. One of the issues I think that we are generally experiencing is that trans people are often objectified. And because of that, most people don't quite understand the everyday struggles that gender non-conforming people encounter in their lives. Would you be comfortable perhaps sharing some parts of your own personal experience and some of the challenges that you have encountered in your life?
Yeah, totally. You know, I thought that living in New York City, I would experience so much more acceptance because I grew up in a conservative small town in Texas. And so my illusion was that the city was somehow more progressive. And in some ways it is. But in other ways, what I've actually found is that every single day that I go outside, I'm afraid for my physical safety because I'm exposed to hundreds, if not thousands of people. I don't know what they're going through. I don't know what trauma they have. I don't know what their ideologies, their politics are. And so people often displace themselves on me. So this looks like constant verbal, physical harassment. This looks being followed home. This looks like having trash thrown at me. This looks like having people take photos of me without my consent. This looks like people taking those photos, turning them into memes online, me finding them weeks later, being like, wow, people were taking photos of me I didn't even know. You become a spectacle. And the reason you become a spectacle is because, once again, they want to do a PR campaign to say, if you stand out, we're going to punish you. So you have to conform back. Because I know that I'm often only hearing the people who are having visible reactions, but I'm willing to bet that there are thousands of people who internally are thinking, that's possible? Could I do that? And so that's why I keep doing what I'm doing, is not for the immediate reactions that come from people who are underdeveloped in their own healing practices, but actually because I want to show that it's possible to live a life outside of the Western gender binary, that it's possible to actually live a life on your own terms, which is what I feel like my art practice actually is about. If I had to synthesize what my project as an artist was, it would be really living on my own terms. And that living is the art, not the poetry, the fashion. Those are all extensions, but it's actually the life work, the kind of energy that I'm producing in a given moment. Then I think the next thing that's really important to understand about the trans community as it relates to fashion, and maybe this brings up the Harry Styles cover again this morning, is people are more comfortable with visible displays of gender nonconformity if it's under the sort of umbrella of art. So it's okay if it's like in an art gallery, or if it's in a magazine, or if it's on a billboard. But then the minute it's next to you in public, that becomes a problem. And so what ends up happening now is this moment where we have masculine cis people like Harry Styles who are wearing women's clothing, and that's amazing, but they will get congratulated for it because they're just doing it for an editorial shoot. Whereas someone like me, who's doing it every single day outside in public with no film crew, I don't experience that sense of accolade or celebration. And so a lot of what I'm trying to get people to understand is it's not enough to just ambition for the billboard or ambition for the runway. We have to create a society in which everyone can look like whatever they want, wherever they want. And once again, that's the difference between fashion style for me. What I'm trying to generate here, and I think a lot of my thinking about this is indebted to a Black queer scholar named Madison Moore, who in their book Fabulous describes style as political glitter. And one of the things that Madison says is that style, when it enters a room, leaves traces of itself. And that idea of style as a political modality is so central to what I'm doing. Is even if I'm not immediately shifting people's minds, I know that they're never going to be able to think the same way.
Mm-hmm. May I share an observation with you? I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on this are. I think that the lack of broader conversation on these topics contributes towards misgendering and contributes towards violence and so on. The concept of gender binary is very strongly ingrained in the mass subconscious. And I noticed that even cisgender people who want to look beyond this, they often don't know how to do that. In some cases, people avoid engaging with transgender individuals out of fear of offending them by accident, simply because they don't know what the social expectations of the transgender and gender non-conforming community are. I'm sure that you have come across this as well, and I was just wondering, what is your take on this?
Yes,
Not everyone is hostile.
Right.
Not everyone wants to be hostile.
Right. I totally agree. I think that there's actually a majority of people that are open and receptive. They just don't know how to express that. Mm-hmm. That's why I wrote my book, Beyond the Gender Binary. It's kind of in the light, blinded out. Yeah. But what I tried to do in this book is I give all of the arguments that are used against trans and gender non-conforming people and how to respond. And what I wanted to basically do is improve gender literacy, because I think that right now, most of these gender topics are relegated to the academy and to high theory. And so only people who are trained academics who learn about things like post-structuralism can access a critique like we were discussing of biology as a cultural phenomenon. And so I wanted to find a way to translate that to the masses. So I wrote this book at a 12-year-old reading level, mm-hmm. where I could explain to people like, hey, here's some metaphors to help understand this. So one of the metaphors that I employ is color theory. So I say, blue and red are not opposite colors, and there's as many colors as we can imagine. Same thing with gender, and when you provide those kind of easy parallels, then I think it clicks a lot more for people. And then also, I genuinely feel like it's okay to be wrong if it's coming from a commitment to being better. So I think, a lot of people are like, I'm afraid of being offensive, but the way that we learn is by messing up and learning. And so it actually holds us both back whenever we're not willing to be wrong. And so I think that what I ask of people is a practice of vulnerability, to move with your best intentions, but then to know that you might say things that are insensitive, but to know that that's just part of your growth and that's part of the growth. And I think most trans people actually are okay with that. We'd much rather have people who are committed to learning than people who are hostile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on this, because I'm pretty sure most people, would like to engage in a positive way, but nowadays there is often this notion that people also want to be offended, and they're using an opportunity to, kind of use that as a counter conversation, which I don't think is very productive. I think what you're saying is really more productive. It doesn't need to be a confrontational way for a message to be put out there. In fact, quite the opposite, because I think most of the time when a confrontation happens, just the two groups are being distanced further away from each other rather than trying to bridge, the differences. So thank you so much for sharing this context, and actually I will look up the book as well. I'm curious to learn more on that topic as well. As my final question, what is your advice to any trans or gender non-conforming young people who are struggling to embrace their own identity? What would you say to them? We have some of our students as well here, who are in that category. So what would be your advice for them?
My advice is I can't give you a magic potion to make it easier. All I can do is say that you have to jump into the discomfort and figure it out as you go. is like, I think that we keep on waiting for like a road paved with rainbows, and it's just not going to happen unless we build it. And so I can say that, you know, I was in a similar place where I was terrified, I was scared of expressing myself. And certainly there was pushback, but also there was so much joy on the other side. And I don't think that we speak enough about that joy, the joy of being able to look in the mirror every day and say, I chose this form. I'm happy in this form. And then I think the second thing I would say is really learning trans history makes things feel so much more possible, because it was only through learning trans history that I learned that there have always been people like me, because I didn't know that in school. I didn't read about that anywhere else. And so when I found out that, you know, we're responsible for some of the biggest cultural sort of achievements, I'll offer two books as citation. One is Work, A Queer History of Modeling, Elspeth. And what she sort of describes in this book is how in the early 1900s, a lot of queer designers in New York City ended up coming up, like the first paid photographer at Vogue was actually a queer designer who came up with artificial light as a concept in fashion photography. So what we actually see is the cultural and aesthetic contributions of our community is separated from those actual people. And when you learn those names, you're able to be like, there have always been people who've been contributing to society like me. And the second book that I think really moved me was called Gay New York by George Chauncey. And it's a history of LGBTQ life in New York prior to Stonewall. And I was able to see photos, images, glimpses that there were people like me, which gave me the confidence to recognize I'm part of a longer lineage or legacy. So even though you might feel new or lonely, remember that you're actually part of this deeper historical legacy. And I think that, at least for me, gives me more courage and conviction, because I know that people have felt these same things and done these same things before me.
Alok, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you sharing your insights and personal experiences with me. And it was great having you as a guest.
Thanks so much for having me. It was wonderful.
Thank you.